Good evening. It's truly a blessing to be here with you this evening. We enjoy getting to see those who have partnered with us over the last several years. We have been in Nairobi for 4 years now. We have been back on furlough for the last about 4 months. We came back in mid-June. We've been in Michigan for about almost 3 months. Then we traveled across the eastern coast seaboard all the way down to Florida, where we've been for the last few weeks, traveling to the churches, reporting to those who have partnered with us. And we'll be here for another 4 weeks or so in Florida. And we're trying to report to the churches that have already partnered with us and are supporting us. And then also to seek to add to our support. We're about 80% right now due to rising costs in the area, and also just some changes that have been made through, well, all kinds of things that I won't bore you with. And of course, costs like Obamacare have gotten very expensive for us. So because of that, we're seeking to raise some more support. And so we are traveling through Florida for the next 4 weeks or so before we head up to Michigan for about a little over a month. And then we head back to Nairobi, Kenya in January. It's truly been a blessing for us. We've truly enjoyed not only our time in Kenya, and the family has done very well, they've adapted well, but also it's been encouraging to our souls to come back to the U.S. to see what's going on, what the Lord is doing. And I want to be an encouragement to you as well, even through this evening and through reflecting on what God is doing through you in the hearts of Kenyans and how the gospel is going forward. I pray that you would see that and be encouraged as a church and realize that even as we feel the culture pushing against us and we see things in the United States that seem difficult and we see definite opposition, we also see that God's work is going forward, and we see that the church will not fail. We know that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and God is doing something for His namesake around the world. He's doing that here in Palm Harbor. He's doing that here in the United States. Although sometimes we see it in different ways, He's certainly doing it in Kenya. You see here our family. Of course, Janet is here with me this evening, and our two youngest are Kate and Caden. Carson is with Grandpa and Grandma in Lakeland. He doesn't wish to be here, I got to be honest, but I'll say that his apologies for not being here. We've been able to travel throughout the U.S., and he's been in the same place for 2 weeks in a row now and has made some friends, and he wanted to stay there and to see those friends that he has made. Yes, reaching, preaching, and teaching, those are not the names of our children. We're not that spiritual. This is the categories that you have partnered with us and sent us out to go and accomplish in Nairobi. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But maybe I have to stand a little closer. It says it's on. You got to make that noise. You got to go like that. Yeah. Eep. The laser pointer's working, so it is on. But maybe I'm just a little too far away or something. Or I can just go like this. Yeah, there. There we go. Okay. Okay. Of course, I might have been hitting the wrong direction. I don't know what I was hitting. I just want to fill you in a little bit. I guess I'll keep this in my hand. A little bit on where we are and who we're with. We are sent by First Baptist Church of Lake Orion in Lake Orion, Michigan, through Grace Baptist Mission. And GBM is the mission agency that was started by Inner City Baptist Church, which is in Detroit. They have a seminary, which is where I went to seminary, and They started a mission agency because they had many of their graduates who were looking to go to the mission field, and this seemed like a good thing for them to do. And we have benefited greatly from that partnership. Inner City, Lake Orion's our sending church. Inner City is a partnering church, and of course, we are sent through Grace Baptist Mission, and so that's a neat partnership that we have. These two others are also our teammates that are sent through Grace Baptist Mission. Inner City is their sending church. Dan and Angie Huffstetler up there, and Jeremy and Jenny Pitsley. And of course, this was, I think, Thanksgiving maybe 2 years ago, and most of the kids are sitting around the table. We have each of us have 3 children, And it's a great honor to serve with these men, godly men who love the Lord and are doing a great work. And I think team ministry is important. It is for us anyway. It's not absolutely necessary, but I think it is a good thing to have. It certainly is in the region that we're in. Teams are good for accountability. You send someone over to the other side of the world, and you want to make sure that they stay on point with what you sent them for, but also with moral purity and excellence. And so we have a team that's committed to both of those things. If when any one of us says, I'm thinking that maybe we should be doing this, and then there's a checks and balances to say, but that's not what we were sent to do. And we can have that check, and also we have a tight-knit accountability as well for moral purity. Also, it's good when you come up against those times when maybe either you're homesick or feeling the effects of culture or frustration or any number of things in ministry. The team has been a great approach for us. What is it that you sent us there to do, and why have you partnered with us? And what is our mission? So I'll say it this way. Bottom line is we want to see healthy Kenyan churches. We want to see churches all throughout Kenya that are true to the gospel, are standing on that message, that love the Lord and are passionate about serving Him. And so what we want to do is see healthy Kenyan churches planted. And so we are focused primarily on training churchmen, ministerial training, to see churchmen who love and serve Christ's church. And that, of course, that idea of churchmen has a whole host of ideas that goes with it, a whole constellation that is there, where we're talking about men who not only know what the Word of God says, that's important. We need to know the Word. And we're training men to know the Word, but also that they know the Word and they're acting it out. So we have the philosophy of being within the context of a church. It's not just a standalone seminary, but it's a training institution where we are within the confines of a local church, that we are a ministry of Emmanuel Baptist Church. And we're training men to serve in that church. Not simply that we know what the Word of God says, but are we living it out and acting upon it and seeing the fruits of that? And do we have a passion for Jesus that continues to grow? And it stirs my heart to continue to thrive in that vitality and that passion for God and His Word, as I'm seeking to see the men that I'm working with also being trained up and growing in their passions for Jesus. And so that really is the bottom line. I believe that's why you sent us there and why you have partnered with us, and that's what we're seeking to accomplish. And we do that through a couple ways that I'll get to in just a moment. But I wanted to just maybe remind you a little bit of what Nairobi, Kenya is like, and where we are. We actually live in Nairobi. It is the capital city of Kenya. You can see there on the map. Kenya is here in East Africa. It is the geographical center point of what is considered East Africa. It's also the commerce and economic, maybe also the center point of education and philosophy as well. Part of that, I said, is geographical. Somalia, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya all constitute what is considered East Africa. And so you can see it's in the center geographically, touching all of those other countries. Other than sometimes Rwanda and Burundi are considered part of East Africa as well, depending on who you're talking to. And so it plays a role in the region, and that's why we think it has a strategic role in the area. It's a strategic center of East Africa with a great theological need, as there is in much of Africa in general. Africa in general, sub-Saharan Africa, is not new to the gospel. Most of the works in sub-Saharan Africa are not pioneering works where they're hearing of Christ for the first time. David Livingstone was actually in most of East Africa. He was in Kenya and Tanzania and parts of Rwanda and Burundi and Uganda, and that was over about 150 years ago. So the gospel is not new, but there's always been a need for the continuation. And so mission works typically in missiology these days are broken up into pioneering and perpetuating ministries. And we're in a perpetuating field where we are striving to see something implanted in Kenyans to take it and continue it on. In fact, I said that what our mission is to see healthy Kenyan churches planted. And how do we know that they're healthy? Well, they're fulfilling the Great Commission just like we are. And you see the bottom down here, our goals. Fulfill the Great Commission by seeing the Kenyan church fulfill the Great Commission and laying the foundation for a church planting movement to rise up, an indigenous church planting movement to rise up. And primarily we are working in Emmanuel Baptist Church, which right now is becoming a resource center and hub for the region. Maybe I should slow down for a moment and just say, if you have any questions as I'm kind of going through this, feel free to raise your hand. I'd love to answer any questions. I don't know if that's normal or out of the normal, but feel free, just pop your hand up, and I'd love to answer any questions you have. But one of the problems in all of sub-Saharan Africa is not that they haven't heard the gospel, but then it's been mixed with so much error. There's so many problems with prosperity theology and Pentecostal theology as well, which in Africa, those two go together. It's almost impossible to not have them hand in hand, unlike in the U.S., where you can say they're Pentecostal, but there's no prosperity, or they're prosperity, but no Pentecostalism. Those two generally go hand in hand. And it's having terrible impact upon Africa at large. And there's no true regeneration in much of the continent, although they're familiar with the gospel message. And so one of the difficulties that we have is making clear to someone what the gospel is. And by default, most Kenyans would say, I'm Christian, which simply means that I'm not Muslim. See, by default, a Kenyan would identify himself as Christian, even though he doesn't know any lick of what the gospel is or why did Christ have to die. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to inculcate into the churches and into the area, into the region, is to know the gospel and be able to explain it clearly. Nairobi itself is the largest city in all of East Africa. It's 4.5 million people. It's very cosmopolitan. You'll come across people from all walks of life. Not just economically, but socially, politically, racially, ethnically. It's very cosmopolitan. Of course, it's mainly, it's probably 85%, 90% Kenyan, and the rest are from all over the world. And so there's even a large U.S. expat community because of the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. Embassy has one of their largest embassies in the world is actually in Nairobi. And it's a leader, as I mentioned, in economics, politics, and technology. And so you can see in this picture that it looks like maybe what we call a modern city. And just like most of the world, even in third world context, you have urban centers. And Nairobi is certainly an urban center. What we'd call it is it's urban Africa. Some people come in and say, oh, you know, there's many Western types things. You know, we can go to a grocery store to buy groceries. There's telecom stores. There's like a Samsung store in a couple of the malls. So you can go in and there's Samsung products being sold there. But it's really more of urban Africa because it's still third world, definitely. And you can see that when you get into the layers, drill down a few layers. From here, it looks like maybe somewhat like Tampa. From here, you see, oh, that's not, well, maybe some areas of Tampa, I don't know. Some areas of Tampa look more like that. And as you get closer and closer, you see varying degrees of texture added to that. Any questions on any of that? There's a little trick I played there. You hit to the next slide so that people are like, maybe I don't want to ask the question. No, go ahead.
What language?
Good question. What language do we speak there? Well, Kenya is a former British colony. It won its independence about 52 years ago, I think it is now. Maybe it's 53. And so they speak English. It is the English and Swahili are the official languages of Kenya. By law, all education, all public education has to be done in English. So virtually everyone is fluent in English, especially in any of the cities. Anyone that's a population over maybe 10,000 in a city will have fluent English speakers, almost everyone. And then the more village is probably more Swahili, or actually more likely would be their mother tongue, whatever their tribal tongue is. And Swahili is how the tribes intercommunicate in the village or internal settings. Yeah, good question. So we speak English. My Swahili is workable, but certainly not fluent, and no one would consider it good. Although I have a technical knowledge, so I can, hear and communicate. If I only had to speak Swahili, I wouldn't die. Maybe that's the best way to put it. Any other questions along those lines? You don't get to ask a question, my son. Was there a hand back here? No? Okay. Just scratching the forehead. You got to be careful when questions come and somebody reaches up beyond that. Are people open to the gospel? I would say there's maybe layers of that. So the culture in general is as a hospitable culture. So there's a certain amount of, just out of the general cultural benefit of having a conversation. And I would say, yes, the culture is open by and large to hearing what you have to say. And so you proclaim the gospel and let the Scripture do the work and let the Holy Spirit do the work on the heart. Yeah, good question. And I would say, by and large, it is open to hearing what you have to say. Certainly not hostile like we're seeing more and more in the U.S.
Is it dangerous to live there?
Security.
Wasn't that where the Nairobi, the mall shooting?
Yeah, we're about less than 2 miles away from Westgate Mall, which is the mall where the terrorist attack was 4 years ago, where eventually, to kill the terrorists, they bombed the mall and made it collapse on itself. That's how they got rid of the terrorists. And so security, we had, the first year, terrorism was very much in the news in Nairobi. Every week there were grenades going off in buses, different things happening almost every week. And I remember we had our first conference in the end of May of 2014, first pastors' conference. And we had 2 reports on the first day of that conference. And then we had another one the next day, and it was like, what is happening? And then all of a sudden it went really quiet. And so ever since 2014 in Nairobi, we've had very little terrorist threat. Security just in general is definitely a concern. We don't, I think we live in a fairly safe area, but you have walls, and on top of, around every neighborhood is within a walled community. It's not just the rich, it's everyone who's not in a slum. And you have 8-foot concrete wall, and on top of that is razor wire, barbed wire, or electric wire. Inside there, of course, you have your security guards. Your house has the bars on that, and then within the house, you even have, between our downstairs and upstairs, there's an iron gate. So that's to prevent, thieves are some of it, but also those that in the past they've had problems with people coming in, like taking hostages and holding for ransom and things like that.
Are your kids homeschooled?
Yes, our kids are homeschooled. That is Janet's full-time job, and I don't envy her. She does a wonderful job raising the children, and they're homeschooled. Yes?
What is the main religion?
The main religion would probably be Catholicism as far as organized religion. Apathy is probably the biggest religion, if you could say it that way. Atheism is actually growing. It's a small percentage. It's probably maybe 5%, but it's growing due to influences from the West. Islam is probably around 15%. And I don't know if it's growing. At least in our area, in the central regions, Islam is about 10%. In the northern regions, as you saw in that picture here, Somalia is up here in Ethiopia. Islam is it's probably flipped. It's more like 90% in those regions. Maybe not quite that high, 80%. And down here on the coast, it's also probably the same, 80 to 90% Islamic. Any other questions? Oops. So what is it that we do on a day in and day out type basis, or at least what are those categories that I mentioned? I had reaching, preaching, and teaching. And those are the categories under which you partner with us and have sent us to go fulfill. So we're trying to lay the foundation for an indigenous church planting movement. And let me just start by saying, what do we mean by indigenous? Well, typically we hold that on a 3-legged stool, and maybe I'd add a 4th leg to that stool. To be indigenous, it needs to be self-sustaining, that it's able to fund itself. To be a Kenyan church, it's Kenyan funded. To be indigenous, it also needs to be self-led, self-governed, that it needs to be Kenyans who are leading the churches. It needs to be self-replicating, in other words, that it's planting other churches. And that's actually been probably one of the ways in which the Kenyan church has not been moving forward, and why we're there and what we're trying to see happen is to see all of those three, and then this fourth leg really inculcated and driven down deep, and then see it move on to the next level, especially the self-replicating. And then the fourth one is self-perpetuating. And one thing that's a big emphasis of what we do is to instill a philosophy in, of course, in the church and churches that we're working in, but also in the area at large through conferences and through our interaction with other pastors who come and train, is to have grasp a hold of this philosophy that says the church is responsible for training her own leaders, to training the next generation that are going to be leading the Kenyan church. And this is a problem that's not only manifested in the Kenyan church. I believe we see it in the U.S. church as well, but in the Kenyan church for so long, it's been we outsource all of that responsibility to missionaries and to seminaries. And in the U.S., we do it by outsourcing it to seminaries. We say, here's our brightest and best, go off outside of our church and outside the life of the church, and you professionals train someone into the scriptures, and they essentially become professionals, and then we invite them back in and we utilize their skills in the church. And I don't think that that's necessarily wrong. I don't think it's best, and it's certainly not what we see as the model in the scriptures. And so we're trying to instill a philosophy that says, the church, we're responsible for doing this. We're responsible for raising up the next generation of leaders at varying levels. The church at large should be built up in understanding what the scriptures say. And then the leaders should continue to be trained and developed in a craftsman-master type of relationship or apprentice-master type of relationship where pastors are coming alongside and mentoring them and teaching young men in the scriptures. And so we do quite a bit of that in trying to instill that philosophy. So I said these categories, reaching, preaching, and teaching. And what we're saying there is reaching is the idea of reaching the lost or personal evangelism in daily walk. It's the things that we're all to be engaging in just as believers. In making disciples, it's the first step. And then preaching would be the concept of course, church planting. And to be indigenous church plant, I believe that we're most effective cross-culturally, not as the primary church planters, and also I think it aids in indigenization, to be coming alongside Kenyans who are planting those churches. So Kenyans who are planting churches, for instance, right now, Dan, our teammate, is launching a church alongside a Kenyan named Andy Matoke. And they are launching a church on the west side of Nairobi. And Andy is the lead and Dan is assisting him, which is, Andy knows the culture better than we ever will. He's Kenyan, and we could be there for 50 years and he'll still know Kenya better than we do or will. And so there's cross-culturally, I think it's most effective to have a Kenyan leading, but also indigenously, I think it's most effective for Kenyans to lead. The Kenyans own it then. It's not the missionaries' work, it's the Kenyans' work. And so that's how we work primarily in preaching. I'll show a few more things as we go in just a moment about what else that means and how I'm involved in that. And then teaching is the training and replication of servant leaders. To see, we have an institution, but also I already mentioned the philosophy that we're trying to instill at large. But an institution where we're training pastors and training leaders from not only within Emmanuel Baptist Church, but others in the region who are coming, especially pastors. Now, many of these pastors who are coming from prosperity and Pentecostal backgrounds. In fact, some of them are actively teaching that in their churches. And so one of our entrances, we have a couple primary means of saying, can you attend East Africa Baptist School of Theology? And one is, why did Jesus have to die? So understanding the gospel and that they're truly believers. And number two is, can you sign up to our creed, Orthodox Christian doctrine, and also agree not to be schismatic when you disagree? And if they do that, then we want to have an impact and influence upon men that are coming from Pentecostal and prosperity backgrounds. And we're actually seeing those guys come in and they're changing. And they're becoming what the Bible shows to be a healthy church and led by healthy doctrine and pastors. And it's one of the unique things that I think we're seeing occur in our area of the world. And so we have a teaching center. This is the church that we work out of right now, Emmanuel Baptist Church, that's becoming a healthy hub church. And it's able to resource the region with strong ecclesiology, which I believe is, when it comes to missions and missiology, really missions is about a strong ecclesiology. What is the church to be and what is she to do and who are we as a church? And Emmanuel, which is led by a Kenyan and Kenyan head pastor and Kenyan leaders in general, we're working in there and with them to see a strong ecclesiology built up in the region. Any questions on that? Yes?
Children, do they have to go away to learn after they reach a certain age?
We don't plan to send our kids away to learn, other than college, university, probably here in the U.S. So it will probably be homeschooling all the way along. Good question. Was there another one? Yes. The funny thing is, most Kenyan children don't want to speak Swahili. And so I used to greet some of the kids, I'd joke around in Swahili, and they'd answer in English. It's part of it's a class type of thing. And it's they perceive it as only the poor people will speak Swahili. We don't even want to speak Swahili. And so our kids, they speak English because that's what all of their friends speak. Now they can speak Kenyan English, which is Kenyan accent upon English, and use the Kenyan idioms and things like that. Kate won't perform for you, but she and Kaden are both quite good at it. Other questions? Yes?
How many members in that church?
Now, yeah, good question. Emmanuel Baptist Church, when we first got there, was about 200 who would be attending on a given Sunday. It continues to grow. Ken is a strong biblical and dynamic leader. Ken Mbugwa, who's the Kenyan pastor. Under Ken, it's grown to about 500 who attend on a Sunday morning, roughly. And it continues to grow, and that's not through stealing sheep from other churches. There aren't too many sheep to steal from other good, solid churches. It's mainly from new growth, new believers, young people. The country's young in general, but the church is filled with people 30 and below. It's probably, I don't know, would you say 80% 30 and below? Maybe a little less, 70? I don't know. It's a good high number. She always quibbles with my numbers. I'm not trying to make them up on the fly. I'm really trying to be honest, but so it's a young church with a lot of good, strong, new growth. Yeah.
Is the government supportive of missionaries?
The government is supportive of missionaries because it means money for them. In fact, I pay more in Kenyan taxes, far more in Kenyan taxes than I do in U.S. taxes. So the tax rate is about 30%. Then I have to pay Kenyan taxes to stay in the country. So primarily for them, they know it means money coming in. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is the church a top priority for families now? Or is it getting like this American?
Mm-hmm.
The church is not the top priority.
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of parents see it's kind of the culturally accepted thing to do is to attend church on Sunday. I would liken much of Kenyan culture in the terms of church and some other ways as well. It's similar to like 1950s Americana, at least what I've been told about it and what we think about it. But it's rapidly, much more rapidly than the American move from 1950 to 2010. It's moving much more rapidly on that line, the Kenyan culture is, than we did. It's not going to take 60 years to get to the point that the U.S. culture is, I don't believe, unless something changes radically. And part of that is most parents think, I want my kids in church, but a lot of dads won't go. And so there's something where there's a push to, we think this is maybe good or maybe earning favor with God or something like that. It's not to the point where the U.S. is, but it's moving along that trajectory, probably faster than we arrived here. Yes?
Kenya have a lot of abortion.
Not legally. Abortion is illegal in Kenya, but there's a lot of illegal abortion. But generally, most Kenyans believe it is wrong. Doesn't mean they won't have abortions, but they believe it is wrong. Yeah. There's something about, when we have the law written on our hearts, there is something about that as being image bearers. We understand that this is a real human life. Yeah. Yes, it is a tent. It is a tent that the church meets in, which is, it's a great point that we get to make to our kids every week is the church is not a building. It's not even a place we go to. I usually say to our kids is we get to gather together as a church body, which is kind of a neat lesson. But yes, it's a tent. They say it'll seat about 700 in there. We've gotten about 500 total that I've seen at any one time. We were talking about this afternoon with one of the pastors at the church we were at this morning. What is the perception of Kenyans and of Americans? I think most Kenyans believe that basically 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 3 Americans is homosexual. They believe, what is shown in the news media, basically that we've lost our minds as Americans. And they have a warped view, and so you always feel like you're defending something, or sometimes trying to say, they might believe that, but here's why. And they're definitely, America is seen as, by and large, the world views Americans as good, industrious, very hardworking, very humanitarian, some of the most kind people. In fact, I get that comment quite a bit, that most people, just to give a story, when we were first going over to Kenya, everywhere we went, it just seemed like the Lord would bring, we had small kids, 3, 6, and 7, something like that. And you're moving across the world with these young kids. Everywhere we went, there were people there to help us with bags and do this and that. And I was giving this story to some people, some other expats who were in Kenya, and they said, everywhere you went, they were Americans that were helping you, weren't they? I said, yeah, I guess they were. And she said, it's not because you're American and they're American. It's because they're American. Americans, more than any other country, have this, I'm going to help. I see a need, I'm going to help. And I think that's a good perception, and that's how the world generally perceives America, and that's how Kenyans do. But also there's a lot of negatives. They believe, because of what they see on sitcoms and the news, they believe it, basically half the population's homosexual and other things like that. Good question. Just a few other comments. I mentioned that one of the other ways that I work in church planting is, I didn't mention what it was, but here it is. It's working with church planting interns. So there are men who believe that maybe the Lord is stirring them or calling them to be church planters. And so what we do is we enter them into a church planting internship. Here's a picture of, this one here is Ken Mbugwa. He's the pastor who preaches every week almost every week at Emmanuel Baptist Church. And here's another local pastor. And these other guys here, these are church planting interns who believe that the Lord is calling them to plant churches. And so we have a year-long internship to instill philosophy of what is the church and what is she to be and what does missions look like, what is church planting, what kind of church should we be, along with practical skills and things like that. And I meet with them, Ken and I meet with them every Friday for several hours, and we talk through philosophy and things that they've been reading and writing about. There's a program where they're assigned books with a certain number of pages. They have to write a paper on each of those assignments every week, and we have discussions about that. I meet with a couple of them throughout the week, and we just talk through character, morality, purity, personal purity and righteousness, and disciple them as well. And so that's another avenue of church planting, is working with the men who believe that they're called, and the church is now going to equip but also affirm their giftedness. And some we've said, maybe no, And others we said, well, probably wait. We're not ready to lay hands and commission you for gospel ministry yet. And a few are, okay, we're going to keep working and we're moving toward let's do this soon. This is East Africa Baptist School of Theology. This was about half the students in a day of prayer this past springtime, right around then. And you'll notice that technology is playing a greater and greater role, which is making theological education much more accessible with tremendous resources that are available for free and online. And we're reaping the benefits of that, and especially as we develop new curriculum, we're trying to take advantage of that as much as possible to get the education as close to free as possible. This is East Africa Baptist School of Theology, where we meet for classes. You can see here the part of the tent. So you had the one picture with the tent there, East, the building. So you can see it's on the church property. It's a ministry of the church. East Africa Baptist School of Theology, or EAPS as we usually say, is where we meet. We have a great library, probably the best library in all of East Africa that I know of. Some say of Africa, some other people have traveled. It's a tremendous modern theological library that has been put together there. And we have some classrooms, and it's also used by the church for teaching on Sundays. Any questions on any of that?
Women's role in the ministry?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see many women pastors or women wanting to get
In the culture, it's a given that women are going to be pastors. It's not even questioned culturally. It's not questioned within the churches. It is a problem in our church. So that sets us apart. We're definitely complementarian. We don't obviously allow women pastors, and by that, immediately you're countercultural. And you fight that, similar to an egalitarian emphasis in the U.S., people would say, what? Are women less? Things like that. And it gives us an inroad to talk about, well, what does the Bible teach? Here we are, Reformation Sunday, 500 years of Protestant Reformation. Sola Scriptura, the primary cause of the Reformation. And so we get to drive back to Scripture constantly. Yeah, good question. Here you see just a few of the discipling relationships. I wanted to show you some faces. We already mentioned Ken Mbugwa. I mentioned Annie Matoke, so this is the guy that is planting a church now on the west side of Nairobi. Philo is one of the guys who's been there from the beginning, working through East. He's nearly finished, and he's actually beginning to teach classes, as well as these other two guys. They're starting to teach classes at East, and that's a great thing. We're starting to see even the seminary becoming indigenized. There's a lot more I could say there, but I won't. Here's some of the ladies that Janet works with. She works with, every Saturday they have a ministry that goes into the slum that's about a half a mile away from the church. And Janet works with them once, sometimes twice a month, and they just continue to give the gospel. Love on these girls, try to help them with some of their physical needs where it's appropriate. Some of the girls, what is the average? Like 20 sometimes, 30? The most I've seen is maybe 40 girls who come. And some of these girls are the income provider for their family, and they're 14 years old, and they have to do kind of like maid work because the mother is gone and the father is lame or something like that. And so there's a tremendous need, physical need, but they're trying to meet the spiritual needs. We have a conference every year in May, I mentioned earlier, and this is I think this is the past conference. There were 400 some church leaders from around East Africa who came, some from Tanzania, Uganda, and so forth, and Ethiopia, and of course Kenyans. And we host a conference, and we try to just help church leaders with resources and with equipping so that they can go back and lead healthy churches and have their churches become increasingly more healthy, and to build a network where these are trusted guys around the area, men who are seeking to also do the same type of thing in various stages. And so this has been a great opportunity. This year, the conference title was, or the conference emphasis was the church, which is the pillar and support of the truth. And so we just taught all about what is a healthy church? What does it look like? Practicing membership and discipline and biblical baptism, biblical leaders, male leadership, and the ordinances and things like that. And tremendous response. It continues to grow, and it's having an impact in all of East Africa because of that. And so we're trying to really see a vision and equipping of the region, and Ken is a great spokesman for that. Now you've seen him for the third time. He's a dynamic leader, a godly leader, a biblical leader, and because of that, EBC is continuing to have more and more influence, and that's a good thing. It's healthy and it's indigenous. It's truly Kenyan, and we're thankful for that. And we see that this means that at some point in the future, we're going to be unnecessary. And I don't know exactly when that is. I know what it will look like. I don't know what the timing will be. And really, I think that that's part of a strong missiology in our philosophy of missions. Is we have to know what it looks like for me to be useless on that field, and that's what I'm working for. That's what we should be working for in missions, is that I'm not needed, the Kenyans are doing this, and maybe I need to be somewhere else, wherever that is. And really just a final note is that God's passion, He has a passion for His glory. He is seeking to draw worshipers from this earth to see the kingdom built for the glory of His name, as people come and one day will bow, every tribe and tongue and nation and people, to give praise to the King. So the mission of the church is missions. That is what we are going to do. We are making disciples amongst the peoples of the earth. And the mission of missions doesn't end there. It's not just to see people drawn in to be worshipers of the King, but they're drawn into this community of worshipers. The mission of missions is the church in this age. That's the vehicle, the institution that God is using to bring worshipers into the kingdom. And so that's what we're trying to do, to establish healthy churches and to see Kenyans perpetuate those churches into the future. Any questions? Maybe final questions or thoughts? Yes?
I've been trying to figure out just how to phrase this, but I would assume because of how indigenous that church is, you probably don't have a problem with any pushback. We do it this way, you Americans do it this way.
That's an excellent point, excellent thought and question. We really strive as much as possible not to instill our own way of doing things on the Kenyan church. And part of that is, having Kenyans leading it from the outset when it's a church plant or something, that we're not going to do it the American way, but we want to think through what is the biblical way, what are the sine qua non, unarguable, this is the foundation, this must be here. But that might look in very different ways, still building on the same principle in various cultures. And so we don't have that problem. We haven't had that problem of American versus Kenyan because, for one thing, we try to say we're Christians, and we almost always, bow isn't the right word. We definitely subjugate maybe if there's a differing of opinion, and I say, I think it should be done this way, and he says, I think it should be done this way, and it's not an argument about the biblical principle, we're going to say, okay, we're going to do it this way because that's the Kenyan leadership is moving in that direction. I think the partnership there has been very, very healthy, and hopefully we'll continue to see that grow and expand, and also that our tribe would increase, that there would be more and more of that synergy, to use the business terminology, that synergy between what we call expats and Kenyans. I hate to use the term natives because that might have negative connotations, but the indigenous people, in this case Kenyans. Good question. Yes?
Do you have a problem keeping the music program godly and worshipful, or is it just?
Do we have a problem with it? I don't think so. The typically Kenyan churches consider, they've been built on American hymnody for the past 100 years. And that's typically what a Kenyan church thinks of as worship music. There is a growing more and more influence of all kinds of American and other places around the world. That's not the case. I mean, EBC is a pretty, what's the word? Sober doesn't sound right. It's a serious, we come to worship God. We come to reflect upon God's glory and see Him in the Scriptures. So what we see at EBC is a serious tone, and which is not to say that it feels like a funeral or something like that. But we understand the reason that we're here. It's not to, though we do have exuberance and we do feel good, it's not primarily so that we feel good about ourselves. It's that we worship God, and there's a joy in doing that. Yeah. Good question. Yes?
Do you have any cool weather in Kenya?
Yeah, the weather, that's always, I don't know, the high out there today felt like it might have been 65. That would definitely be the coldest day in Nairobi. Most of the time, the coldest days are about 68. The hottest days are maybe a high of 85. It doesn't get super hot in Nairobi. We're over a mile above sea level. Every night is somewhere between 51 and 58 because of our altitude. And most people say, wow, that sounds perfect. But I hate it. I think it's always too cold. I like it hot. 85 is nice. It's very arid. It's not humid. So the thing that we have a lot of, because of just the geography, we have a lot of cloudy days would be a good way to describe it. Overcast, especially during rainy season. It feels like we go 3 months without seeing much of the sun. It's there. It's not as bad as I grew up in Michigan. Now that's awful. Buffalo, I know that can be bad. You don't see the sun, it feels like for half the year. It's not that bad, but it's not as sunny as I would like it to be. It's funny because everyone says, oh, that sounds like perfect weather. And it just proves, Kenyans are constantly complaining about the weather. No matter where you go, everybody complains about their weather conditions. It's a good lesson for us. What should be the mark of Christians is gratitude to God, right? Any final questions? Well, thank you so much for allowing us to come tonight. I wanted to share that and encourage you. I really do want to encourage you that the Lord is doing something. You heard how the church has expanded from 200 to 500 in 4 years, and we don't want to focus in on the numbers, but especially it's not because it's an attractional model. We have serious music. The preaching is at least an hour. The services are well over 2 hours. It's not because we're doing something that would pull people in off the streets and they'd say, wow, it's a short message, or the music makes me jump out of my seat or something like that. It's unexplainable except to say God is doing something. And the gates of hell are not going to prevail against His church. And we should be encouraged in that. That even in days when it seems like there's hostility and darkness, that God is doing something. He is going to see His name worshiped. And He's going to call out worshipers for His name's sake and see the kingdom advanced. And you get to be a part of that through supporting us. And I'd love to have any of you at any time come on out, visit us. Certainly, Pastor, you're invited. We'd love to have you come. We would love to just share more and more of this because we're excited by it. I was just with church this morning, and one of the men who, he came in, was it February this year? They came out and visited us, he and a couple others. And he also visited, I think they visited 4 missionaries in their 3-week trek around the world. He said, I was just the most encouraged by what was going on in Nairobi. And that's not because of us. It's because of God and what He's doing. And we want to encourage you with that. And I think it is an encouraging thing. I think it's a wonderful thing. God is at work, and His name will be glorified. And we praise Him for what He's doing. I've gone well over my time. I don't want to bore you any longer, Pastor.